Former member of the Beatles, John Lennon. He will not be singing for us this morning. He is deeply involved in trying to prevent himself from being deported. The United States Immigration Department says that a drug violation for which he was found guilty, or which he pleaded guilty in England in 1968, is grounds for his deportation. We'll find out about that charge and what his chances are of staying in this country in a few moments, but right now we have the news and weather from Bob Jameson. Bob? Station break. My left is John. I wonder if you get tired of people introducing you as the former Beatle.
It's an improvement on ex. I like former better. In England, I'm an expatriate and an ex.
As such, I mean, when you disband, does the name go somewhere and the whole thing just go off into oblivion? Or?
And the Beatles name will continue because it's a Beatles Limited, you know? Mm-hmm. And there's lots of Beatles product that's repackaged. For instance, last year there was 2 sets of double albums that did as well as anything we put out when we were together. And there's a film in the offing that's comprised of all films we've collected from all the tours and all the interviews over the world that is being put together, which will be called The Long and Winding Road, no doubt. So they exist, but they don't work together anymore.
You haven't worked together in, what, 3 or 4 years now?
Well, let me say, I worked with Ringo and George on Ringo's album. I worked with George on an album of mine. I've worked with Ringo about 2 months ago, and I might be working with George on Friday, folks.
What's happening?
Well, he's in town performing, and we're still friends, you see. Mm-hmm. So we might have a laugh. It's the last night of his tour, and see you Friday.
Listen, before I get to the heavy stuff here on the deportation, let me ask you a few questions that we were chatting yesterday, and you said it is the one thing that people always want to know. Are you ever going to play together again as a group?
It's quite possible, but it's a question, like I told you yesterday, even Cab was asking me. They asked me 2 things. Are you going to play together again? How's your immigration? Mm. And in what form we play together again, I don't know. It's been a physical impossibility for the 4 of us to be in one place at one time. I couldn't leave here because I wouldn't get back in. George and Paul also have problems coming in and out. They have to ask a few months in advance for permission to come in. So the most that's ever been in the country at the same time is 3. There's probably 3 here now by the end of the week, but Ringo's gone back. So it's really been my immigration problem and George and Paul's immigration problem that's kept us from even sitting in a room together to decide or even say hello, although we've done it in different combinations of the 4.
Mm-hmm. So if the immigration problems were solved, you're saying there's nothing personal between the 4 of you that would prevent you someday from perhaps playing again or making more albums or so on?
For us to do that, we'd have to do it more than just to resurrect what went on in the 60s, mm-hmm. you know? So whatever format, and it's not in the offing, but it's quite possible, whatever format we did together, it would have to be interesting to us musically and otherwise there'd be no point. We don't want to just do it for the old time's sake, you know? Sure. We do it because we want to.
Well, you've all gone in different directions and grown and been into different things. But what about the celebrated feud between you and McCartney and so on? Was that all blown out of proportion?
Well, it was half and half, you know? I mean, if I get knocked down by a taxi cab, it's a celebrated person being knocked down in a taxi cab. Or if I get married, divorced, it's celebrated. So the Beatles had a divorce, and Paul and I were always the sort of out front ones. And so our celebrated feud, you know, Lennon McCartney we wrote the songs, etc. It was bigger, and I think I put it down now to we're all probably very nervous about suddenly being on our own, although we all really wanted to get away from each other for a bit after living in a room together for 10 years. Mm. And then suddenly you're on your own, you know? So there was a little bit of that, but that's all gone.
Well, we'll get back to this, but while we're here, I want to talk about this affair that's at hand now.
Oh, just one more thing. This is the first time that all of us are in the charts at the same time since the split. We all have albums, singles, everything, zooming up the charts, folks. Isn't that nice? Separately, but together.
You want to hold it up?
Well, I wouldn't want to be so commercial as to hold up Walls and Bridges, #1 with a bullet, out now with a new single, #9. At your local store, thank you. God bless you, and let's get on with business.
just did the business.
Oh, I did. Good.
Let me see if I can set some background here. In 1968, and I want John to relate the story to you, he was arrested on a narcotics charge in Great Britain. And subsequently, when he came to this country it wasn't actually to perform, it was to try to find Yoko's son.
No, it was her daughter. It was a custody case.
Sorry.
It's very complicated.
Custody case. It's very complicated, which really doesn't have anything to do with this particular issue. There is a law in the United States, the immigration law, that has some automatic provisions that if there is ever been a conviction of this type, no matter what, it is grounds for automatic deportation. Mr. Leon Wiles, who is John Lennon's lawyer, is with us here this morning, and I think he can probably explain it better and give us some of the ramifications behind it. So would you take a moment or two and explain what the case is about?
Our immigration law provides that people who have been convicted even of very minor offenses involving narcotics or marijuana may not be admitted to the United States. That is basically John's problem with respect to admission. His conviction was the most minor imaginable, even in England. And even in England, the law has been changed, and the statute under which he was convicted has been wiped off the books. Mm-hmm. And most recently, the British Parliament even passed a law wiping out his conviction completely. Nevertheless, our law is immutable, very, very difficult to get about, and that's his main problem in the United States.
Would you, it took you about 15 minutes to tell it yesterday, but would you shorten that and tell about the arrest in London?
Well, I'll start it off by saying I was planted by a Sergeant Pilcher who became very big and is now in prison, along with a lot of his colleagues, including his boss. But I was lying in bed with Yoko, not married to her, living together in England and getting some weird press because she was Japanese and I wasn't living with my Anglo-Saxon wife. And 2 weeks before I was bust, a friend in Fleet Street called me and said, the cops are coming for you. They've got Mick and everybody, and they're coming for you next because you're the loudmouth. So, but not only that, but I wasn't even smoking pot at that time, and that's for real. But I knew that many other rockers had lived in the place before me. One morning, we're just lying there asleep. Suddenly, there's a banging on the front door. And Yoko goes to the door and presses the button and says, who is it? And they say, it's a message from Apple, our office. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, a message from Apple. So it was a woman's voice. She opened the door and there was a woman and about 5 guys there. And then they started to push the door. And they didn't say we're the police or anything. She just shut the door and ran in and sort of collapsed on the floor and said, there's a whole pile of people at the door. And meanwhile, there's another one at the bedroom window by then. They'd come over a roof. I mean, this was like very well organized. And they were banging and banging. We were terrified and naked. And they kept saying, police, police, and they had plain clothes on. I thought, I don't know, cops, mafia, what is it? You know, what do they do? And I said, well, I want to just put my trousers on. But they said, no, if you don't open it, we're going to bust the window and the door down. So I was still really terrified. And he was holding this piece of paper up. I was pretending to read it just to stall for time. What do I do? What do you call a lawyer? What do you do? What do you do? Is this real? Is it cops? What is it? I finally let them in. He said, right, I've got you for obstruction of the law anyway. And the comedy was that they only had 2 dogs that could smell marijuana in London at that time. And the dogs were late. They're on another case, so they had to stall for about an hour. And they were running all over the house, all over the place. And they separated us, and they broke their own rules, which is you're supposed to be there while they're searching, but they were all over the place. They wouldn't let me call anybody. They wouldn't let me call the office to say I couldn't come to a press conference that I was supposed to be doing. And then finally the dogs arrived. And they'd already searched the place. And there was a room full of junk that I'd brought from my previous home that was like cameras, equipment, and everything. On the mantelpiece was a binocular case. And he called the Pilcher the one in prison, calls me over and says, "Is that your binocular case?" And I think, I'm living in a basement, but I know it must be my binocular case. Yeah, it's my binocular case. Then he says, "Will you look inside it?" I looked inside it, and there's a little piece of hash, which is compressed marijuana, about that big. And he says, "Do you recognize that substance?" I said, "Yes, it's hash, and I don't know anything about it." And subsequently, because I wasn't married to Yoko, I was terrified they were going to throw her out of the country, because the press was really weird at the time. And I made a deal that if they left Yoko alone, I would plead guilty and pay £100 fine, a couple $100, and that would be the end of it. I made a deal with the cop, and he dropped the obstruction charge, and they took me to court and and be a good boy and people in your position. I didn't even suspect I'd been planted then. I thought maybe the chauffeur had brought it in the case with the stuff. Years later, after they'd bust George, who was all planted but also happened to have some as well, which I told you that, because those days it was open. I called George and I said, I was planted. Were you? He says, "Oh, sure. Sure, they couldn't see the stuff on the table, so they stuffed about half a pound of it in my boot in the bedroom, just to make sure of it." And that's the whole story.
Mr. Wiles, how does this, what do you think of the story, and how does this fit in with American law? Could that have been made in the United States, that case?
Such a conviction could never have occurred in the United States. The law in England at the time provided that if a man acknowledged that he owned a container, he was automatically responsible for the contents of that container. It was a law that was universally criticized and later repealed. We are claiming, as one of the items on appeal in John's case, that the application of such a law here in the United States denies him due process. And as an alien in this country, he's entitled to due process.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about your life in the country in a minute. We've got to pause here, and I do want to say one thing. The main reason why John Lennon is here this morning is that a congressman from Long Island, Republican Norman Lent, has petitioned President Ford to intervene in this case and have the charges against him dropped and the deportation proceedings abandoned. We'll be back, and I'd like to talk with John Lennon about musical life in this country and cultural life in just a moment, but first we have this message. I'd like to turn to a different topic now, if you don't mind.
I'd love to.
There are, I think most people would agree that you and the other Beatles had a profound influence on cultural life in this country. Would you agree with that?
Well, in a way, I'd agree. Whatever our influence was, we were the, I can't think of the word, but we were the projection of what was going on anyway around the world. And we were the figureheads, or one of the sets of figureheads. And we were reflecting what was happening to us as children, to us as teenagers, and what was happening on the streets. And we took it on stage, as it were, only the stage was because of media like TV.
Now, you were a lot of your troubles stem now from a drug incident. Could you talk for a minute about how you feel about drugs in general?
Well, I mean, it's such a subject. I mean, what drugs are we talking about? The housewives' drugs, the Libriums and the Valiums, and the ones that the doctor will give you if you just go in and say, "I feel funny," or the ones that you have to pay for on the street?
Well, let's talk about marijuana.
Marijuana, I still am not convinced it's harmful. I don't promote it.
A lot of people in this country sort of felt that you were responsible somehow for the changes that a lot of people either, one, don't understand, or two, don't like. Do you accept that responsibility in any way?
No, I don't, because A, we were reflecting what was going on anyway, and B, like I told you last night, I won't use the exact wording, but the announcement, well, I will, the announcement about LSD was when one day the English TV put Paul against a wall and asked him a certain questions. And we don't like lying. They said to him, "Have you taken this LSD," which the famous Timothy Leary, and most of it came from America, my dear, came. And he said, "Yes." Then they said, "Do you feel responsible for what the question you just asked me. And Paul said, I feel as responsible as you. Please don't broadcast this program, because you're as responsible as I am if you're going to pin it on me. So they broadcast it. And that went worldwide. The main thing was that he'd taken it, not the bit about the dialogue with the journalist. Now, who's responsible, me or you? You know, you're the journalist. You asked me, have you ever taken LSD? Yes, Jim, I have.
I didn't ask you that.
Yeah, but
I asked you what you thought about it.
What I thought about it? At the time, I hadn't seen any for a long time, and until they started lacing it with poison and arsenic, it seemed quite all right to me. And I never met anybody who jumped out of a window, but which is in the government consumer's report. My opinion of marijuana and drugs is very similar to the one that the American government's consumer report on drugs, and it's a very detailed report.
Going through these deportation proceedings, and this has gone on for a couple of years now, I'm wondering if as you contend, the federal government is hassling you. Why do you want to live here?
I want to live here because to me, England was almost a 59th state. America has more influence on the world than it realizes, or still has and did have. I was brought up on Doris Day and Rock Hudson American movies. They didn't even make English movies without an American or a Canadian in it. And the music that turned me from being an artist or a writer, which is what I wanted to be, was American rock and roll music, which came originally from the ghetto, black ghetto, and that's where this is Rome to me. America is Rome in the days of the Roman Empire, and I want to be in Rome. If it had been the 18th century, I would have been in Paris.
What are you doing here now? You can't work.
Oh, I can work.
You can't work for money, though, can you?
Can I, Leo?
That's an interesting question that I could write a book about.
You got less than a minute to answer.
I don't know.
Well, you're playing charity concerts mostly, are you?
Well, there was a time when I wanted to go on the road, but the immigration kept calling me in and taking me to court, so I had to disband the band I had. My work is mainly done in the head, writing songs and recording, and that's all I really do. And if people want to hear what I'm singing and saying, they buy it, and if not, they don't. And that's what I enjoy doing, and that's what I'll be doing all my life, probably. John Lennon and Mr. Leon Wiles, attorney representing Mr. Lennon in these deportation proceedings, thank you both very much for being with us. Thank you. We'll be back after this message.